Lucas, come back to the house. I want to sign the divorce papers tonight. A beat of heavy silence crackled over the cell speaker. I could hear faint laughter in the background, Chloe's soft, simpering giggle, the high-pitched chatter of their son Jax, and my chest tightened so hard I had to grip the edge of my leather sofa to steady myself. I'd spent 7 years loving this man, clung to the childhood promise we'd made to each other back when both of us had nothing, and now he sounded annoyed at the mere interruption of his perfect little second family. Elena, cut the dramatic stunts. We've gone through this dance 100 times, stalling, threatening to storm over to Chloe's apartment, refusing to sign. None of it works anymore. I'm not rearranging my evening schedule just so you can throw another screaming fit in front of me. His voice carried that cold, dismissive bite I'd grown accustomed to over the last 3 years, like my pain was a minor inconvenience, ruining his evening plans. I forced my tone flat, no tremor, no trace of the rage that used to bubble up and spill over into screaming matches at the county courthouse steps. If you don't drive over here within the hour, I'll head straight to Chloe's rental complex myself. I've got nothing left to lose these days. I hung up before he could fire back another cruel retort, set my phone face down on the coffee table, and folded my hands loosely in my lap to wait. Every surface in this empty suburban mansion still held traces of Lucas's life with me. His tailored flannel shirts hanging on the laundry line out back, his scuffed leather loafers lined up by the front entryway, the long chestnut hair I'd grown out over 6 years, just because he'd once mumbled it looked softer against his collarbone. Back before Chloe, before the endless divorce threats, before he'd started hiding entire weekends away with his other family, he'd loved running his fingers through that hair for hours on end. Now none of it mattered. The doctor's prescription pill bottle sat tucked inside my sweater pocket, a constant cold reminder of how little time I had left. If I dragged this divorce war out any longer, I'd waste my final months wallowing in resentment instead of letting Lucas walk free like I'd promised myself I'd do once the end drew near. 47 minutes later, the front door slammed open hard enough to rattle the wall-mounted mirror in the entry hall. I glanced up from the stack of pre-signed divorce paperwork spread across the coffee table, and my blood ran cold when I spotted Chloe trailing directly behind Lucas, small Jax clinging tight to her hand, his little backpack bouncing against her hip as they stepped over the threshold into my home. This was the first time I'd laid eyes on them both inside the walls Lucas and I had built together, the house we'd purchased right after our wedding 7 years prior. I'd avoided every run-in with Chloe for 3 years flat, never sent threatening emails, never showed up at her apartment to yell, never confronted her in Lucas's office parking lot, despite every single friend, every distant family member, every mutual business associate telling me I had every right to unleash hell on the woman who tore my marriage apart. But staring at her now, standing in my foyer like she owned the space, I felt a strange, hollow numbness instead of the boiling anger I'd anticipated. Lucas's jaw locked tight the second he caught my unblinking stare fixed on Chloe and his son. He stepped forward, one hand planted firmly on the wall beside my shoulder to cage me in against the sofa, his voice sharp and laced with unbridled hostility. Really, Elena? This is the game you're resorting to now. You beg me to rush home to hash out divorce terms, then bait Chloe and Jax into coming along just to stage a scene and guilt trip me. You'll pull any desperate, shameless trick if it means holding on to me for another week, won't you? 3 years ago, that accusation would have split me open. I would have screamed, shoved his chest, dissolved into messy sobs, and reminded him we'd grown up side by side, that I'd funded half his startup's early operating costs with my family's inheritance, that Chloe was the one who chased him at the corporate holiday mixer 3 years back. Today, I only tilted my chin up, reached for the top copy of the divorce agreement, and slid the stack across the table between us, my thumb brushing the crisp signature I'd printed neatly at the bottom margin hours earlier. I'm not staging anything. Look at the paperwork. I already signed every page, every addendum, every asset division clause without a single pushback. Lucas's eyes narrowed with visible skepticism. He snatched the stack off the table, flipped through each page fast, scanning the legal fine print line by line like he expected to spot some hidden loophole I'd snuck into the text to trap him. When he finished reading the final page, he stared at my signature for a long stretch of seconds, a flicker of confused surprise mixing with the unrelenting bitterness on his face. Without a moment's hesitation, he grabbed the fountain pen he kept on our home office desk, scrawled his signature across every blank line allocated for his approval, and tossed the paperwork back onto the coffee table like the document weighed nothing at all. A bitter, mocking smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth as he folded his arms over his broad chest. Can't say I saw this coming. After 3 years of fighting every legal motion tooth and nail, you suddenly flip a switch and beg to dissolve the marriage overnight. What's your endgame here? You think signing the papers will make me reconsider cutting Chloe out of my life? I lifted the signed divorce contract, folded it gently, and tucked it against my chest, my gaze steady as I delivered the quiet truth I'd been carrying alone for 2 weeks. I'm done, Lucas. Letting you go finally gives you the freedom you've been begging for all these years. His entire frame stiffened instantly. I watched as Adam's apple bob hard once, his brown eyes flicker with a split-second flash of raw shock, but the emotion vanished faster than it arrived, replaced by a vicious, cruel laugh that sliced straight through my already fragile heart. He leaned down, his face inches from mine, his tone dripping with unvarnished malice, no trace of softness left for the girl he'd once sworn to protect for the rest of our lives. Then you'd better hurry up and get it over with. I don't want our wedding anniversary tomorrow tainted with the bad luck of a dead ex-wife hanging over my upcoming wedding to Chloe. Be at the county clerk's office by 8 sharp. Don't even think about showing up late and backing out last minute. That single line landed like a sledgehammer against my ribs. Tomorrow, the day he'd scheduled our divorce filing, marked our 7th wedding anniversary. I'd clung to that date for years, secretly holding on to the delusion he'd eventually remember, that a flicker of our old love might resurface and make him call off the divorce entirely. But he'd completely erased that milestone from his mind, so wrapped up in planning his future life with Chloe, he couldn't spare a single thought for the years we'd shared together. Before I could muster a single word of reply, Lucas grabbed Chloe's wrist, herded Jax toward the front door, and slammed the wood shut so hard the framed wedding photograph hanging above the entryway wobbled on its nail. The silence that crashed over the mansion after they left was suffocating, every empty room echoing with the faint ghost of our old laughter, the quiet nights we'd spent curled up on this very sofa before Chloe ever stepped foot in Lucas's life. I sank back against the sofa cushions, running a shaky palm over the signed divorce papers clutched in my hands. 3 years of brutal, exhausting legal warfare, all wrapped up in less than 10 minutes of tense conversation with the man I'd loved since childhood. It felt like a one-woman performance that no one had bothered to watch, a tragic solo play with zero audience sympathy. I unlocked my phone minutes later, scrolling to Lucas's Instagram profile out of some masochistic urge to witness how quickly he'd celebrate our split. Sure enough, a brand new public post sat pinned at the top of his feed, a clear photograph of our signed divorce contract laid flat on his car dashboard, captioned simply, "New beginnings ahead." Every single comment underneath overflowed with warm congratulations from his business partners, distant family members, college fraternity brothers. Even Lucas's parents had left glowing heart emojis beneath the post, fully aware I'd have full visibility of every interaction thanks to our shared social media friend list. He unspared a single thought for how that image would carve me open when I saw it, hadn't hesitated to broadcast the end of our 7-year marriage to every person in our mutual social circle without a shred of consideration for my feelings. Of course, he wouldn't care. Once a man's heart shifts fully to another person, the woman he once claimed to adore becomes nothing more than an obstacle to sweep out of his path. I wandered over to the laundry room window and stared out at Lucas's clothes fluttering gently in the evening breeze, the shoes lined up by the front door, the long hair I'd kept just for him cascading down my back. I'd lied earlier, back when I told Lucas releasing him was a selfless choice. If my body hadn't started shutting down from the late-stage terminal illness eating away at my organs, I would have fought this divorce for another 10, 20, 30 years, clung to him until the day I naturally aged, never surrendering my marriage to Chloe and her son without a brutal fight. The boy I'd loved my entire life wasn't someone I could ever voluntarily hand over to another woman, not if I'd had the physical strength to hold on to him. My mind drifted back to the night I'd first uncovered Lucas's infidelity 3 years prior, the quiet, calm conversation I'd initiated instead of blowing up immediately like most betrayed spouses would have done. I'd sat him down on this same sofa, voice steady despite the way my hands shook, and asked plain, unfiltered questions about Chloe, desperate to understand what she possessed that I didn't. What does she have that I lack? Is she younger? More conventionally beautiful? Does she fill some void I've left empty in your life? Lucas had fallen silent for a long stretch, visible irritation creasing every line on his face, like my honest inquiry was an unnecessary burden he didn't have the bandwidth to unpack that night. He dragged a hand roughly through his dark hair before delivering the brutal explanation that had haunted my every waking thought ever since. Elena, there's nothing objectively wrong with you. You're brilliant, loyal, generous. You give every piece of your heart to our relationship without holding anything back. But that overwhelming devotion weighs on me constantly. I live in fear I'll never measure up to the perfect standard you've set for a marriage, that I'll somehow fail to deserve all the love you pour out for me. Chloe's different. She's quiet, skittish, soft-spoken, but she'll nudge at my attention like a shy kitten, never demanding everything I have to give all at once. Being around her feels effortless, no crushing weight of obligation hanging over my shoulders. I'd stood there listening to his justification as the evening wind whipped through the open laundry window, gathering his damp button-down shirts off the clothesline and folding them neat, just like I'd done every week for 7 years. Once I finished stacking the laundry basket on the counter, I reached into the back of my bedroom nightstand drawer and pulled out the small white prescription pill bottle my oncologist had sent home with me 2 weeks prior. The printed label read that consistent medication could stretch my remaining lifespan out another 3 to 4 months, but each passing week would bring sharper, unmanageable pain that would leave me bedridden for days at a time. I'd resolved weeks ago to stop refilling the prescription once the divorce finalized tomorrow. There was no point dragging out a slow, agonizing decline just to spare Lucas the minor inconvenience of bad luck at his upcoming wedding to Chloe. This quiet surrender would be my final, unspoken act of love for the man who'd stopped loving me long before my diagnosis. I twisted the cap off the pill bottle and stared down at the small white tablets rattling inside, weighing my 2 choices: cling to 3 more months of suffering just to linger in a world where Lucas belonged to someone else, or let the illness run its natural course once the divorce paperwork filed through the county clerk tomorrow. A sharp, stabbing pain flared through my abdomen without warning, doubling me over against the kitchen counter as cold sweat beaded across my forehead. That's when a text alert pinged on my phone, a private message from Sadie lighting up the screen. I just got off a call with Ethan. He swears Lucas's parents already booked the wedding venue for Chloe and Lucas 6 weeks from tomorrow. They fully expect you to pack all your belongings out of the house by the end of this weekend. My blood turned to ice reading the words, realizing Lucas hadn't just planned our divorce for our anniversary. He'd spent months prepping every logistical detail to erase my existence entirely from his life before I even knew I was terminally ill. What other secrets had he been hiding from me for years that I hadn't yet uncovered? The next morning broke far earlier than I'd anticipated, loud knocking echoing against the front door before 6 a.m. I dragged myself off the sofa, every muscle in my body screaming with dull, persistent ache, and pulled the door open to find 2 burly men in black company security uniforms standing on my front porch, their expressions flat and unyielding. Ms. Hale, Mr. Bennett sent us to escort you directly to Chloe Mercer's residence for the divorce filing prep. We're instructed not to leave until you're in the vehicle with us. He's concerned you'll backtrack on your agreement overnight. I hadn't even brewed a cup of coffee, hadn't eaten a single bite of breakfast, but they stepped forward and gently herded me toward the waiting black SUV parked along the curb, not allowing me a single minute to grab a jacket or my medication bottle off the counter. I'd assumed we'd head straight to the county clerk's office first thing in the morning to finalize the divorce decree, but the security driver merged onto a highway heading toward the opposite side of the city, Chloe's upscale apartment complex, the same building Lucas had rented for her and Jack's 3 years prior, a fully furnished luxury 2-bedroom unit he paid the monthly rent for out of his personal corporate bonus funds. My feet dragged against the tiled entryway floor when the security men pushed open the apartment building's glass front doors, a sharp wave of revulsion washing over me as I recognized the address. A middle-aged housekeeper pulled the front door of Chloe's apartment open a crack the second we approached, pressing a single finger to her lips to hush me before tugging me fully inside the living room. Mr. Bennett and Ms. Mercer are still asleep upstairs in the master suite. Take a seat on the sofa quietly. They'll be down within the hour. The housekeeper vanished into the kitchen without another word, leaving me alone in the unfamiliar living room to stare at the wall-mounted entertainment cabinet front and center. Resting on the glass shelf sat a framed, full wedding-style portrait of Lucas and Chloe, professionally shot 6 months after he'd first admitted his affair to me 3 years prior. Every piece of luxury furniture, every decorative vase, every children's toy scattered across the carpet had been purchased with Lucas's credit cards. All the material comforts he'd refused to shower me with over 7 years of marriage poured freely onto his mistress and their son. I'd never once received a single professional couple's photo shoot as a wedding anniversary gift, but Chloe had gotten a full bridal portrait session before she even held any legal claim to Lucas's life. Heavy footsteps creaked down the wooden staircase minutes later, and I lifted my gaze to watch Lucas descend the steps in nothing but rumpled silk sleepwear, faint purple love marks scattered across his bare collarbone and chest where Chloe's nails had dug into his skin overnight. My eyes burned with a fresh wave of unspoken grief, and I twisted my head to stare at the blank wall beside the entertainment center to avoid processing the intimate marks covering his torso. Why the hell are you in this apartment? Who gave the housekeeper permission to let you inside? Lucas's voice carried immediate, unbridled fury the second he spotted me lingering on Chloe's living room sofa, his long strides eating up the distance between us in 2 quick steps before he wrapped a tight grip around my wrist and began dragging me back toward the front door to toss me out into the hallway. The housekeeper sprinted out of the kitchen mid-motion, a damp dish towel clutched in her hands, and planted herself firmly between Lucas and me to block his path toward the exit. Sir, Ms. Mercer specifically told me to invite her inside this morning. If you force Ms. Hale out now, Ms. Chloe will be extremely upset with you. Lucas's grip around my wrist loosened instantly at the mention of Chloe's wishes, his jaw tightening with suppressed frustration as he released my arm and stormed toward the master bathroom without another glance in my direction. I lingered on the sofa, listening to the housekeeper mutter quiet complaints to herself in the kitchen as she washed ceramic mugs and silverware, her voice loud enough for me to catch every bitter word she spoke about my presence disrupting Lucas and Chloe's perfect domestic bubble. 3 years Miss Chloe's had to live as the secret side piece just because this woman refuses to sign divorce papers. Little Jax gets teased relentlessly at preschool for not having his father's legal last name tied to his mother, all because Elena Hale's too selfish to step aside and let them build a proper family together. Miss Chloe is such a gentle, kind-hearted woman forced into the role of a homewrecker through no fault of her own. I sat frozen on the sofa, absorbing every cutting accusation the housekeeper tossed my way, a cold, bitter realization settling deep in my bones. Every single person in Lucas's orbit had rewritten the entire narrative of our marriage to paint me as the villain holding back the star-crossed lovers Lucas and Chloe. Everyone ignored the fact Lucas and I had grown up side by side, legally married for 7 full years before Chloe ever entered the picture, ignored that I'd never once harassed Chloe or her son, ignored that Lucas had actively chosen to cheat and father a child with another woman while bound to our marital vows. To every outsider looking in, I was the cruel, stubborn wife clinging to a man who'd already fallen for someone else, the selfish obstacle standing in the way of their perfect happy ending. No one stopped to ask how much damage Lucas's betrayal had inflicted on me. No one bothered to consider the lifelong childhood trauma I carried from my own broken family, the reason I'd clung so fiercely to our marriage as my only stable anchor in the world. I'd never told a single soul about the fractured childhood that shaped my desperate attachment to Lucas, how my parents had split up when I was only 3 years old, each immediately moving in with their separate extramarital partners and treating me like an inconvenient burden they'd rather abandon entirely. The only person who'd stepped forward to take me in all those decades ago was Lucas, begging his own parents to open their family home and provide me a safe, stable roof to live under when every other adult in my life had turned their backs. That foundational debt of gratitude had tangled itself into overwhelming, lifelong love for Lucas, making his betrayal 3 years prior feel like the second time I'd been completely abandoned by every person I'd ever trusted. But as I sat listening to the housekeeper's venomous gossip about me being the sole source of Chloe's suffering, a quiet, unformed suspicion flickered to life in the back of my mind. What if Lucas had hidden a far bigger secret about our shared childhood from me all along? Something that explained why he'd grown so restless and eager to escape our marriage the second Chloe offered him easy, low-stakes affection without the weight of my lifelong devotion? I didn't know it yet, but Lucas carried rebirth memories from an entirely separate timeline where our entire life together had unfolded in reverse, memories he'd never planned to reveal to me until long after our divorce finalized. Lucas emerged from the bathroom 10 minutes later, dressed in crisp tailored slacks and a navy polo shirt, his hair combed neat to cover any trace of the night he'd spent with Chloe upstairs. He paused a few feet away from the sofa where I sat, his gaze flicking over my frame from head to toe with a faint, curious furrow between his brows. Have you lost a significant amount of weight recently? You look gaunt, like you haven't eaten a full meal in weeks. For half a second, I let myself entertain the fleeting delusion he might actually care about my declining physical state, that some faint fragment of our old love still lingered beneath all the resentment and betrayal. But his next sentence shattered that fragile illusion entirely, his tone shifting back to detached, transactional curiosity within a single breath. Whatever diet regimen you're following seems to work well. Could you share the routine with me? Chloe's been throwing daily tantrums over wanting to slim down, and every time I suggest simple calorie cutting, she snaps at me for not understanding her struggle. Name your price. I'll write you a check for whatever consulting fee you demand for the weight loss tips. My fingernails dug deep into the soft leather of the sofa armrest until I felt tiny pricks of blood well beneath the skin, the sharp pain grounding me through the wave of crushing heartbreak washing over my chest. I lifted my head to lock eyes with Lucas, my voice low and sharp with suppressed hurt. Aren't you terrified I'll sabotage whatever weight loss plan you pass along to Chloe? You think I'd willingly hand her advice that improves her appearance, knowing every small change only pulls you further away from me? Lucas paused, genuinely mulling over my question for several seconds before nodding slowly, a cold, distrustful glint in his brown eyes. You're right, I shouldn't take the risk. Your history of holding grudges makes it entirely plausible you'd slip something harmful into her routine just out of spite. He'd completely erased every single kind, forgiving choice I'd made over the last 3 years from his memory, never confronting Chloe, never leaking photos of their son to our mutual acquaintances, never filing harassment charges against her for showing up at our family events uninvited. In his mind, I was a bitter, vengeful woman fully capable of hurting Chloe to reclaim his attention, no matter how much evidence existed to contradict that harsh assumption. Soft footsteps sounded on the staircase behind us, and I twisted my head to watch Chloe descend the wooden steps, her shoulders hunched inward, her expression wide-eyed and delicate, like she just walked in on a brutal marital argument between Lucas and me. She paused halfway down the flight of stairs, her voice thin and trembling, as if my presence alone stressed her out beyond measure. Lucas, are you two fighting again because of me? I hate being the source of all this tension between you and Elena. Lucas's entire demeanor softened the instant Chloe spoke, every trace of anger vanishing from his face as he crossed the living room in 3 quick strides to lift her fully off her feet, cradling her against his chest as if she weighed nothing at all. Before I could process what he was doing, he tilted her chin upward and pressed a deep, lingering kiss against her lips, holding the embrace for a full 5 minutes straight with zero regard for my broken heart sitting mere feet away on the sofa. Each second of that prolonged public display of affection felt like a fresh blade slicing through my chest, a silent, brutal reminder that Lucas reserved all his tenderness and romantic passion exclusively for Chloe now, leaving nothing but cold hostility and dismissive cruelty for his legal wife of 7 years. A quiet voice repeated the same devastating thought on a loop inside my skull. Elena, walk away. You've loved him far too long, endured far too much pain for one lifetime. It's time to stop clinging to a love that died 3 years ago. Chloe pulled away from Lucas's kiss eventually, her lips glistening with his cologne and lip balm, and turned to face me directly, a gentle, almost placating smile tugging at her mouth. Elena, would you mind stepping into Lucas's home office with me for 5 minutes? I'd like to speak to you privately without him overhearing our conversation. I stood slowly from the sofa, my legs weak and unsteady from the persistent abdominal pain radiating through my torso, and followed Chloe down a narrow hallway toward the spare bedroom Lucas had converted into a small home office inside her apartment. The space bore zero resemblance to the home office Lucas maintained inside our marital mansion, where every surface had once been lined with his work documents, strictly off limits to me per his 3-year-old rule that I never interrupt his professional space. This office overflowed with feminine touches Chloe had scattered across every surface, rose-tinted lipstick tubes left uncapped on the oak desk, tiny plastic dinosaur toys Jax left scattered across the keyboard tray, half-empty bottles of vanilla hand lotion tucked into open desk drawers. I still vividly remembered the day I'd accidentally wandered into Lucas's office back at our marital home 4 years prior, how he'd snapped at me with uncharacteristic coldness and ordered me to exit immediately without touching a single document on his desk. Back then, I'd brushed it off as him being stressed from startup work deadlines, but staring at Chloe's personalized office space now, I wondered if he'd already emotionally checked out of our marriage long before he ever admitted his affair to me 3 years ago, if his heart had already belonged to someone else years before Chloe even crossed paths with him at that corporate holiday mixer. Chloe closed the office door softly behind us, crossing to the desk to pour me a glass of cold bottled water, sliding the tumbler across the wooden surface toward my waiting hands before settling into the leather office chair across from me, her expression soft and seemingly remorseful. I owe you a genuine apology, Elena, for everything I've put you through over these past 3 years. I stared at the woman sitting across from me, studying her delicate facial features, plain, unremarkable bone structure, modest middle-class family background she'd openly admitted to Lucas early on. I couldn't wrap my brain around why Lucas, a self-made multimillionaire tech CEO who'd once promised the world to me, had traded 7 years of shared history and loyal devotion for an unassuming administrative assistant with no wealth, no elite education, no long-standing bond tying them together beyond a fleeting office attraction. I'd spent over a decade building my entire identity around loving Lucas, and Chloe had swept in and stolen that central piece of my life in a matter of months. How had she managed to unravel everything I'd spent my whole life nurturing so effortlessly? I folded my arms tight across my chest, my tone sharp and unyielding as I responded to her hollow apology. A single sorry doesn't erase the fact you inserted yourself into a committed 7-year marriage and bore a child with my husband while our legal union was still fully intact. You can't wipe 3 years of suffering off my shoulders with one simple phrase. Chloe's eyes welled up instantly at my blunt accusation, her lower lip trembling like my harsh words had wounded her deeply, as if she hadn't actively chosen to pursue a married man knowing full well I existed waiting for him at home every night. I grew up with two schoolteacher parents who drilled strict morals and marital respect into me from childhood. I understand the weight of the label, homewrecker, more than anyone, and I've carried that shame every single day for 3 years straight. But the truth you're refusing to acknowledge is simple. If I truly wanted Lucas to file for divorce immediately 3 years ago, he possessed unlimited financial and legal resources to force the split through the courts without dragging this fight out for years. He chose to delay the finalization all on his own, no pressure from my side. Her statement landed with brutal clarity, forcing me to confront a fact I deliberately buried deep for years. My family's entire private investment portfolio, the company my parents had founded decades ago, relied entirely on consistent capital injections from Lucas's corporate venture fund. He held complete financial leverage over my entire bloodline, yet he never threatened to cut funding to force me into signing the divorce papers early on, despite every opportunity to wield that power against me. I never intended to destroy your marriage entirely, Chloe continued, wiping a stray tear from her cheek with the pad of her thumb. If it weren't for Jax, our son, I would have happily stayed in the background as Lucas's secret partner forever, never demanding a legal marriage certificate or public recognition of our relationship. I lifted an eyebrow, skeptical of her manufactured martyr act, and leaned forward slightly across the desk to lock eyes with her directly. So, what exactly are you trying to tell me right now? Are you hoping I'll praise you for your self-sacrificing attitude and step aside voluntarily to hand Lucas over to you without a fight? Chloe's delicate face paled at my unforgiving tone, her eyes glistening with fresh tears, but I refused to soften my stance out of misplaced pity for the woman who'd broken my entire world apart. I tilted my chin upward and delivered a quiet, prophetic warning I'd carried inside for months, watching every flicker of fear cross her face as the words sink in. Lucas abandoned our 7-year marriage for you, without a second thought. Don't fool yourself into believing he'll stay loyal to you for the rest of his life. If another soft-spoken, easily adoring woman crosses his path 10 years from now, he'll leave you and Jax behind just as quickly as he left me behind 3 years ago. Chloe's mouth fell open, stunned by my blunt prediction of her own inevitable heartbreak down the line, and before she could formulate a retort to defend Lucas's character, Lucas knocked twice against the office door frame, announcing we needed to leave for the county clerk's office to finalize our divorce decree, scheduled to land exactly on our 7th wedding anniversary, the day he'd completely forgotten held any sentimental meaning for the life we'd once built together. As I pushed my chair back and stood to follow him out of the office, a dull, crippling pain exploded through my abdomen, so severe I nearly collapsed to the carpet, catching myself on the edge of Chloe's oak desk to stay upright. Lucas glanced back over his shoulder, noticing my unsteady posture, but instead of stepping forward to steady me, he simply checked his wristwatch and sighed with visible impatience, reminding me we'd miss our clerk's appointment window if I wasted another minute lingering inside Chloe's apartment. In that single cold, dismissive gesture, every lingering shred of quiet hope I'd clung to that Lucas still harbored any leftover affection for me dissolved entirely, and I realized I'd signed my divorce papers under the false assumption releasing him would end all my suffering, completely unaware of the most devastating layers of Lucas's hidden rebirth secret, the truth about our reversed alternate timeline lives. Still waited buried beneath every cruel choice he'd made over the last 3 years. The rental car's tires bit into the wet coastal highway asphalt as I drove away from Chloe's apartment that morning. Divorce decrees stamped official 7 years to the day Lucas and I had exchanged wedding vows. My whole body hummed with a bone-deep, unrelenting ache. The terminal illness gnawing at my organs flared sharp every time I breathed too deep, but I didn't reach for the pill bottle tucked in my coat pocket. I'd canceled all pharmacy refills the second the clerk slid that signed, filed divorce paperwork across the counter to me. Lucas's parting words still echoed loud behind my skull, cold and careless as he called security to escort me off the property the second formalities wrapped up. Stay out of our lives for 6 months. Once Chloe and I are married, you can come back to collect whatever junk you left in the old house. Don't make a scene before then. 6 months, that's all he offered. 6 months of exile as punishment for 7 years of loving him too fiercely. The second those words hit my ears, every last thread of quiet longing I'd clung to frayed and snapped clean. I pulled out my phone mid-walk to the SUV, deleted his number, erased every saved photo, unfollowed every family member and mutual friend tied to a circle, and texted Sadie one single line. I'm flying to Vancouver tonight. Don't tell anyone where I land. Sadie picked me up from the international airport 3 days later, 8 months pregnant, her husband Ethan trailing a step behind her with a folded blanket and a water bottle ready for me the second I stepped off the plane. The moment she spotted my gaunt frame, sunken eyes, hollow cheeks, she burst into messy, unrestrained sobs, ignoring Ethan's quiet plea not to overexert herself in her state. She tried yanking me into a crushing hug, and I held her back gently, terrified my worsening physical state would send her spiraling into panic labor early. Elena, how could he do this to you? Her voice cracked, hot tears streaking down her cheeks. All those years you loved him unconditionally, you funded his first startup, you stayed loyal through every fight, and he tosses you aside like broken furniture the second Chloe bats her eyes at him? Ethan rested a steady hand on Sadie's shoulder to calm her trembling, his gaze sliding over me with a heavy, weighted sorrow I couldn't parse at first. Something deeper than generic sympathy, a buried grief he'd spent years hiding behind his calm, mild venture capitalist persona. Let's get you back to our beach house first. We can talk everything through once you're settled. I didn't argue. The ocean air here smelled like salt and freedom, nothing like the suffocating, polished luxury of Lucas's Seattle mansions and Chloe's cookie-cutter apartment complex. For the next month, I forced myself to eat tiny bites of food every 2 hours, even if every mouthful triggered violent, gut-wrenching vomiting. Sadie hovered nonstop, begging me to let her schedule a specialist appointment, but I brushed her off with hollow excuses about heartbreak-induced weight loss. I couldn't bear to drop the terminal diagnosis on her, not when she was weeks away from welcoming her newborn baby. Her joy deserved to stay untainted by my inevitable death. One evening when Sadie had fallen asleep early from pregnancy exhaustion, Ethan knocked soft on my guest bedroom door, faint whiskey scent clinging to his blazer, his usual easygoing demeanor stripped away entirely. He leaned against the doorframe, jaw tight, eyes glistening with suppressed emotion I'd never once seen from him in our 30 years of friendship. "You're dying, aren't you?" It wasn't a question. I froze mid-sip of lukewarm herbal tea, then nodded slowly, gesturing him inside and shutting the door to muffle our conversation from Sadie's sleeping form down the hall. I pulled the white prescription pill bottle from my nightstand drawer and set it flat between us on the oak nightstand, laying out every brutal detail of my late-stage diagnosis, the doctor's timeline, the choice I'd made to skip pain medication and let the illness progress naturally after signing the divorce. "Promise me you won't tell Sadie. She can't handle this right now, not with a baby due in weeks." My voice came out thin and shaky, stripped of every ounce of the quiet strength I'd forced around Lucas and his family for years. Ethan stared at the pill bottle for a long, heavy minute before nodding, a quiet, defeated agreement rumbling in his chest. "I'll keep your secret as long as I possibly can." "But Elena, don't write yourself off completely just because Lucas walked away. This world still has people who love you without hidden conditions." I laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that stung my raw throat, leaning back against the headboard. Loving Lucas consumed every part of my life since I was 3 years old. My parents dumped me the second their affairs turned permanent, and Lucas's family took me in. He was my entire safe space, my whole future, my only constant for 32 years straight. When he threw me away for Chloe, I lost every reason I had to fight to stay alive. There's no going back for me, even if I missed every single exit off this road years ago. Tears spilled unbidden down my face as I laid bare the childhood trauma I'd never shared with anyone besides Sadie, how I'd latched onto Lucas like a lifeline, how my obsessive, all-consuming devotion stemmed from a lifetime of abandonment, how his betrayal felt like reliving my parents' rejection all over again, twice as brutal. Ethan listened silently, no interruptions, his expression twisting with a complicated mix of grief, guilt, and quiet longing I couldn't name. Back then, I brushed it off as sympathy for my suffering. I had no idea Ethan carried his own fractured rebirth memories, a separate timeline where I'd been his wife instead of Lucas's, a reality he buried deep to avoid ruining his marriage with Sadie. 6 weeks later, Sadie gave birth to a healthy baby boy, and I clung to those small, soft moments with the newborn as my only fleeting reprieve from constant physical agony. But my body deteriorated fast. I could barely walk across a room without doubling over in crippling abdominal pain. My weight dropped to dangerous lows. Dark permanent shadows pooled under my eyes, and even simple conversation drained every ounce of energy I'd left. I knew my time was shrinking down to days, not months. I wrote a sealed letter to Sadie, addressed to be opened only after I was gone, laid out all my savings and assets to leave to her and her son, and handed the envelope to Ethan with strict instructions to delay revealing my passing for as long as he could stand it. Shortly after I finished sealing that letter, news hit our quiet coastal bubble. Lucas and Chloe had hosted a lavish, celebrity-studded wedding 6 months, to the day he'd exiled me from Seattle. Sadie showed me the wedding photos posted across every local social media feed, her tone sharp with unbridled rage at how quickly Lucas had erased 7 years of us to build a shiny new family with Chloe and their son Jax. I barely glanced at the images. None of it hurt anymore. The love I'd carried for Lucas had burned itself out completely, smothered under years of cruelty and neglect. 3 full years passed after I drew up that letter to Sadie, and Lucas never received a single word, text, or call from me. Every outreach attempt he sent to my old phone number bounced back unread. Every letter mailed to our marital home was returned to sender unopened. At first, he'd brush my radio silence off as petty, childish retaliation for the 6-month exile order he'd handed down outside the county clerk's office. He told Chloe repeatedly I'd reach out eventually, begging to move back into the Seattle mansion once their wedding dust settled. But as the months stretched into years, a hollow, unshakable emptiness settled inside Lucas he couldn't outrun. No amount of time with Chloe, no luxury vacation, no milestone with their son Jax filled the quiet void my absence left behind. Chloe picked up on his distant restlessness instantly. Every time he locked himself in his home office for hours, chain-smoking cigarettes, a habit he'd only picked up after I cut all contact. Every time his gaze drifted vacant mid-conversation, every time he flinched away from her gentle physical affection, she felt the chasm widen between them. She'd entered their marriage craving undivided devotion, only to discover Lucas's mind always wandered back to the wife he discarded, the woman he'd spent 2 lifetimes tangled up with. Their quiet arguments turned frequent, bitter. Small slights escalated into screaming fights behind closed bedroom doors, the perfect domestic facade they'd built for social media cracking wide open. Lucas tried to bury the unease by throwing himself into corporate work, hosting endless late-night business mixers at upscale downtown Seattle clubs to avoid returning home to Chloe and Jax. One night, a mutual college acquaintance cornered him in a smoke-filled VIP lounge, slurring a terrible secret he'd overheard from Sadie during a bitter argument with Ethan weeks prior. Word around the circle is Elena's dead man. Sadie blew up at Ethan for hiding it from her for years, swore she'll never forgive him for letting Elena waste away alone across the border, without a single check-in from anyone. Lucas's blood turned ice cold in his veins. He grabbed the man by the collar, slamming him back against a leather booth wall, voice feral and unhinged, screaming accusations of lies and slander until his friends pried his fists loose. Deep down, though, he knew the words rang true. The memory of me standing in our living room 3 years prior, thin and hollow-eyed, whispering I was dying, crashed over him all at once. He'd written my warning off as a manipulative stunt to stall the divorce. laughed off my suffering as a ploy to win sympathy, tossed me out of our shared life without a second thought, and I told him the absolute truth the entire time. That same night, he booked an emergency cross-border flight to Vancouver, his hands shaking so bad he could barely grip his passport. He showed up at Sadie and Ethan's beach house unannounced at 2 a.m. Bloodshot eyes, scraped knuckles from punching the airport bathroom wall, ready to beg for any scrap of information about my final days. Sadie threw herself at him the second she pulled open the front door, slamming her fists hard against his chest, screaming every unspoken grievance she'd held onto for 3 years. How he'd abandoned me when I needed him most, how he'd mocked my terminal diagnosis, how he tossed me aside for a shallow temporary distraction while I wasted away in quiet agony alone. Lucas didn't fight back, didn't argue, didn't deflect blame. He absorbed every blow, every tearful accusation, every curse she hurled at him, his face pale and empty as he processed the full weight of what he destroyed. It was Ethan who finally stepped between them, slipping off his glasses and watched before landing one brutal punch square to Lucas's nose, splitting the skin open and flooding his mouth with metallic blood. That's when the second massive, buried reversal crashed over both men. The secret neither had dared admit out loud for decades laid bare at last. They both carried full memories of a separate past life. In that alternate timeline, Lucas had watched me fall in love with Ethan instead of him, had stood alone at our joint wedding watching me walk down the aisle to Ethan, had spent an entire lifetime consumed by crippling, unending jealousy. That's why he'd raced to claim me first in this life, begged his parents to adopt me before Ethan's family could step in, manipulated every small moment to make sure I loved only him. But the love he'd fought so hard to steal had curdled under the weight of his own guilt. My all-consuming devotion felt suffocating, too heavy to bear, so he'd run straight to Chloe's easy, low-stakes adoration as an escape. Ethan's own fragmented rebirth memories twisted the knife deeper. In the alternate timeline, he'd been my husband, built a quiet, happy life with me, and lost me all over again in this reality when Lucas inserted himself between us. He'd married Sadie to lock away his hidden longing for me, but watching me fade away slowly, knowing he couldn't save me, ate him alive from the inside out. The fight with Lucas shattered the fragile truce he'd maintained with Sadie for years. Weeks later, they separated, their marriage fractured irreparably by the shared ghost of my lost life. Lucas didn't push to see my grave. He knew I'd never want him there, never forgive the endless cruelty he'd inflicted in my final months alive. He flew back to Seattle hours later, covered in dried blood and crippling regret, and found Chloe waiting up for him in the dark living room, her expression cold and furious after hearing rumors of his late-night trip to Vancouver chasing my ghost. She'd spent 3 years tolerating his lingering fixation on me, pretending not to notice his endless guilt and distant longing, but his rushed cross-border trip broke the last of her fragile patience. The fight that followed was brutal, final. Lucas handed her fully signed divorce papers the next morning, offering full custody of their son Jax and unrestricted access to all his financial assets as compensation for the years of half-hearted, distracted marriage he'd given her. Chloe snapped, tearing the paperwork into tiny shredded pieces and screaming she'd never let him walk away from their family, clinging to his arm and begging him to stay, even if his heart still belonged to a dead woman he'd discarded years prior. Chloe's own health deteriorated rapidly in the years after that breakdown, consumed by resentment and unrequited love. She held onto Lucas until her last breath, refusing to release the marriage bond she'd fought so hard to secure all those years ago. Once she passed, their teenage son Jax moved permanently into the Bennett family ancestral mansion, cutting nearly all contact with Lucas, unable to reconcile the cruel, careless husband his father had been to me with the distant, hollow parent he'd become for him. Lucas was left entirely alone. 2 wives lost, a son who refused to speak to him, lifelong friendships burned to ash by his own selfish choices. He liquidated nearly all his corporate holdings, handed control of his tech empire over to trusted business partners, and spent every remaining year of his life traveling from remote mountain monastery to coastal spiritual retreat, donating millions of dollars to end-of-life medical research and women's support shelters, small, hollow attempts to atone for the way he'd abandoned me during my terminal illness. He never remarried, never sought another companion to fill the empty space I'd left behind. Every night before bed, he kept a single-framed photograph on his nightstand, our blurry, candid wedding snapshot from 7 years prior, the last moment we'd both smiled genuinely without resentment or secrets hanging between us. He'd sit with that photo for hours, replaying every cruel word he'd spoken to me the night I asked for the divorce, every dismissive gesture, every